This House believes that secular democracies with substantial religious communities should not allow a separate legal system for those communities. We're talking about Sharia law, we're talking about canon law. We have a few main reasons for this, but first I'm going to give you a quick model. So we are only talking about laws. This doesn't where the political law, the political practice infringes upon a law that is existing in the secular democracy. So only if a religious practice infringes on the laws of the democracy is this going to take effect. And we think this is important for a few reasons. Firstly, we think that often these religious laws are outdated and top-down. This means that they are particularly oppressive. So, oh shit. Okay. So when we are talking about, like, say, Sharia law, we're talking about a situation that came about from systems of power that are extremely old and outdated and historical, right? So when we're talking about things that appear in the Bible and the Quran, we're talking about, like, how many of a certain animal you can buy someone's a daughter for, right? So this practice is no longer used in democracies because society has progressed and society has changed. Now, we think that this is particularly important for another reason as well. We think that this is often used to justify violence. So we think that, like, often when these secular democracies have moved away from these progressive or oppressive sort of historical norms, that we go back to those in order to justify things that have come from the past that the vast majority of people are no longer in favor of. So we're talking about things like in India right now, where leaders are trying to move us back into a situation where the religious law is the only law, and in doing so trying to, like, ban the consumption of beef. We think that this is problematic because it happens when you're not able to only apply this norm to sort of your own religious community, but instead want to put it by force onto everyone around you, which means that not only are you infringing on the rights of the people around you, you are infringing this sort of doctrine on people that did not buy into it. Because in a secular democracy, everyone in that democracy has sort of bought into the laws of the governing force. But in this religion, if you're able to let these people sort of govern themselves, that also will, like, move into the greater society and means that you're infringing those laws on other people. But otherwise, we think that it's problematic because it perpetuates these norms that are no longer created in democratic ways. So we think that, like, when you have these funeral pyres in India where widowers are then, like, burning to death with their husbands because this is, like, what has been done, we think that this, like, infringes upon, like, the laws of said society. But we think that, like, again, you have, like, child marriages in the southern United States because like, virginity is valued really highly in a lot of Abrahamic religions, and so when, like, a 13-year-old is raped, if she, like, then becomes pregnant, like, in Kentucky, she's allowed to, like, marry her rapist, which means that, like, even though in the United States, like, child marriage is illegal, in Kentucky, you have a lot of child marriages going on because, like, in order to, like, save the souls of these girls or, like, save their virginity. So we think that this is, like, super problematic because like, it infringes upon the governing of the whole, which everyone has sort of bought into, but it also unfairly penalizes those people that are most affected.
Last chance.
Yeah.
So would you clarify the model? Because I'm really confused. Like, what do you mean by, like, a separate legal system? So, like, can people opt into the other one?
Right, okay.
Or, like, how does that work?
Right, so this means that, like, we think that this exists sort of like the Vatican in Italy. We think that this exists where there's, like, a smaller group of people that have their own legal system. Like, there are a lot of Muslims in different countries that practice Sharia law, and we think that this is not a problem if you're, like, practicing different, like, cultural norms, as long as those laws of your governing religion do not come in conflict with the laws of the secular democracy. So we think that this comes into play when we're saying that, like, the laws of the secular democracy that you are living in outweigh the laws of the religion. So we think that, like, if your religion says that child marriage is okay, but the law of the land says that it's not okay, we're going to go with the law of the secular democracy, which is that it's not okay, right? So we also think that it's like important to move forward as a country. So we think that like when democracies are able to like move forward with the ideas of progressives, which is what democracy is, that it's necessarily better than the problems that exist in having one old book, which is where most religions hinge upon, that is basically completely set in its ways and not able to change with the wants and needs of the public.
Bye, Sam.
Sorry.
Good luck with your project.
All right, cool. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
All right, sweet. All right. So I'm going to start by telling you, well, first I'm going to start on a little bit of model critique, then I'm going to move on to our own case, and then I'll end by touching on government's case. So first of all, when we're talking about the model, like, I think it's missing the debate to say, like, you can make whatever law you want. I think any, like, halfway decent society is going to set this up as like how America does now. You can't infringe on religion like unless there's a substantial state interest. Like you can't say, all right, murder is legal, we can go out and murder anyone. I think like we all realize that would not be justified under a separate legal system. Like the military has a separate legal system right now, but they don't have like these massive laws like, oh, you can rape people. It's just like there are distinctions in like, I don't know, like is abortion legal, things like that. I think that's more what we're talking about. These laws that aren't like, yeah, like rape, murder. You're not going to be allowed to go out and murder people just because you said it's okay. I think that would just be missing the debate and would make it impossible for UP to prove anything. All right, so let's talk about this. Secondly, on the model, I just want to quickly say, like, we have to realize, like, there has to be some sort of, like, opt-in system here, because how are you going to say, like, oh, these people are Muslim? Like, the government's not going to be able to decide that. So you're going to have some sort of, like, these people have a truly held belief, they've registered for this system or something like that. It's the only conceivable way you could make this work. Yeah. All right. So we tell you, first of all, there's no harm to secular groups. These people will still have the same laws they've always had. But they are benefits to these religious groups that now get to follow their religion more closely because they see it reflected in the rules that they obey in society. Now, going off of that, we tell you in a second point that when you separate these issues, like, for example, how contentious abortion is in America right now, and it affects our political process and our society. If we were to say, all right, people who opt into a Christian legal system, fine, abortion's illegal for them, but for the rest of society, it's still allowed, it's still legal. I mean, consider like when the government shut down over the funding of Planned Parenthood. We see these issues like this that come about because there aren't two legal systems. And if we were to split them, we would see like Christians no longer have to fight for these rights because it exists in their legal system, or Muslims or whatever we're talking about. You can apply this to homosexuality, things like that. And we also see it, the secular people still get the same laws. Now, why this is even better, besides like the government's not wasting time debating these things, but also like right now, when things like gay marriage weren't legal, they weren't legal for the whole country. That was everyone. But when we split these, people can opt into the system where it will be legal. So it's only people who opt to stay in this system who are like Christians or in Sharia law or what have you, that they are held back by these laws. Sure.
Given how fractionalized views of gay marriage and views of abortion are, even within religious communities, do you anticipate having like a different legal system for every single sect of Christianity and every single sect within every single sect of Christianity? That feels like it would be a lot and a little bit unfeasible.
I mean, I could not make this legal system in a year, let alone 15 minutes, but I think there is a way you could make this work. I mean, okay, fine, the Catholic Church, so then there's the Pope who's dictating it. I don't know. My point being, there is a system where this could be set up, and then there would be the secular system that would not at all be relying on religion. All right, we give you a third reason this is good. Say, for example, I'm a Muslim in America. I would far rather be judged by my Muslim peers than, like, the white typical person in America. Like, we have seen how biased America is, and when you're being judged by people who have similar beliefs and experiences to you, we believe that's a much fairer trial, and that gives you better results on the legal side. And our final constructive point is that this will free up time, money, and resources for the secular legal system, because they no longer have to provide all these, like, court cases, laws, fighting over these issues for all these religious groups. Now, quickly, since these are short speeches, let me touch on government's case. Now, they tell you religious laws are top-down and are therefore oppressive. That's literally what government is. The people at the top say, here are the laws, and everyone else follows them. I don't see how they're seeing anything different here. What's it matter if it's a group of cardinals voting versus Congress voting? You see the same thing. Furthermore, these people are choosing this system. We're assuming you can still not be religious and not be in the religious system. Finally, they bring up this, Kentucky example, how this is legal. Yeah, that's exactly the problem with the system we have now, because everyone has to follow this Kentucky law if you live there. So you have to follow these rules, but if we split it and you say, no, I want the secular laws, I don't want to have to marry my rapist, now you have that possibility. See, no one is being coerced on our side of the house. We're just saying this separate legal system exists for people who choose to follow it. Thank you.
I hate 5-minute speeches.
Never would have guessed.
Also, is this just filming our crotches? Did you guys not have it up?
Well, that's sometimes canned actually.
Yeah, I thought it was just recording our audio or something. I wasn't sure.
No,
Spread,
it's recording video. I'm not gonna spread. I'm just going to be efficient. I'm gonna try. Honorable Speaker, opening opposition bases much of their argumentation on the idea that people are actively opting into these religious groups, that they're choosing these religious laws as their own, and that they have meaning to them, and that it would be better to have them separate so that secular people have more access to their own government. I think that their case is fundamentally flawed, because I don't think that people actually have the ability to actively opt in or opt out of these religious groups. I'm going to talk about that in my first point. But I think that it's really important to recognize the way that we set up this debate, right? Because we think that people should have a right to express their religious freedom, but we think that they should do that within the laws of the country in which they're living, within the secular democracy. It's fine to practice things that might be significant to you as long as they do not infringe on the rights of others, and we think that that is where we draw the line with secular laws. And we think that that is very important to recognize in this debate. You can still go to church, but you can't do things like marry your child off to someone at the age of 12, and you can't do things like human sacrifice or something like that that could be religiously significant but that infringes on another person's right. Okay, so 3 main points in this speech. First, why these religious groups are extremely coercive, why they breed extremism, and why this separate but equal idea is not going to function because these people are still living within the societies. So first, why these religious groups are particularly coercive. We think that these groups are especially coercive because they have tried to set up their own group of laws, right? That means they're trying to live as an autonomous unit separate from the state in which they're in. That means they probably have their own schools set up where they teach children within that group. We think that probably they have a very strong sense of community where people only learn from their religious leaders and from people who believe the same things that they do. We think this means that people are not getting access to the outside world. They're not learning about other ways of thinking. That means that just from an ideological perspective, they probably don't have the ability to make active choices to decide what they do and do not believe. But we also think that a lot of people might be very forced into this through economic situations or just by the ability of growing up within these communities. It's very difficult to opt out of a situation in which your entire family is believing a certain thing, especially as a child when you don't have the economic or political ability to up and leave, right? And we think that it can be especially difficult when you've grown up within this institution. Everyone that you know believes in these laws and in this religion. We think it can also be really hard to leave as an adult, right? Even if you see things that are happening that you think are harmful, the religious group is telling you to take on a second wife or to
that telling you that like another group is like morally wrong and that you should go out and literally kill them. We think that when your entire family is based on the and community, it believes in the same things that you do, and that knowing that if you leave, they will literally like strike you from their memory and they won't recognize you anymore, which happens in the Amish if you decide to like stay after Rumspringa and not come back. This is a huge amount of coercion that we think can be very harmful. What does this mean? This means that people aren't actively making the choice to be in these communities, right? So that means that all of opposition's argumentation about how this is an active choice falls in this debate. We think that these people are being forced to obey laws that they do not necessarily believe in, and we think that these laws can be incredibly harmful. Why is that the case? When you look at the kind of laws that we're worried about here, we're worried about things like child marriage, we're worried about things like honor killings, we're worried about things like promoting violence against other groups. Like my partner brings you the example of like extremism, Hindu extremism in India, where they're now trying to go out and promote their beliefs on other people. So why is it, on my second main point, why is it that these groups like breed extremism, and how does that get worse on their side of the house, right? So what you're saying is that these groups within secular nations should have the right to create their own laws. They're going to get even more insular when where they're like not interacting with society, even more than they are now. But we think that like they also are going to still be within the country, right? Like they're not creating their own nations, they just have their own laws. This means that they're still going to be like paying taxes to the system, they're still going to be voting within the system, and if you believe fundamentally that gay people getting married is wrong, and that abortion is wrong, you are going to continue to politically fight to try to make sure that that isn't happening in other places and to other people. Like you think that a fetus is a human, and you're going to do everything you can to make sure that more humans aren't murdered through abortion. That means because you're still a voting member of society, you're going to use the political power that you have as a group of people, a large group of people as is defined by the motion, to try to make sure that you're denying other people these rights. You see this happening in the US to some level. You see this happening in India, where they're trying to like basically criminalize being Muslim, and we think that that is incredibly harmful and likely to get worse on their side of the house. We think that you need to be valuing the lives of minority groups, especially children within these institutions. We think that secular laws that are voted on and decided by a majority of people within the country are likely to be laws that are going to promote the livelihood and the ability of people to engage in like general life. We think that is not necessarily That is not necessarily going to be the case from these religious laws, as my partner told you. They are generally built in a top-down structure and are getting more and more extreme as time passes because people are fighting even more to try to maintain the structure of power that they have been able to hold in the past. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
What'd you call the Amish thing?
Rumspringa?
It's
It's like when the Amish send their...
I remember
I
this.
wrote a whole debate piece about this, and then never
they
ran
just
it.
go off and they get to leave for a year.
Yeah.
They turn up.
Yeah, theoretically. They're like sent off in society, and then they're supposed to like decide if they want to come back or not. And it's supposed to make it meaningful that they're opting in to being within a society. But often it's like also fairly coercive, where they're like not really given the resources they need to be successful, and so then they like come back and are like, wow, being in my community is so great. That's at least what I know about it.
Is everyone ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we think there are like lots of problems with the analysis the government gives you. We'll start with the model that they provide. So they criticize what Will brought up and like this idea of how do you opt in or opt out of the system. But like fundamentally, if there is no opt in or opt out, how do you tell who's in what system? So like if there are two separate legal systems, there needs to be some way of differentiating like who like the Sharia one applies to and how the regular one applies to. And so we think like the only reasonable way to do this is to have like an opt-in policy. So until like by default, until a certain age, you're legally in the default system. And then at that age, you can choose if you want to opt into the Sharia law or the canon law. Otherwise, like there's no... So, like, several reasons why this is the case. First is that it solves all the issues of, like, how do you tell who's what? Yeah, I'm timing it.
Okay. No, but I'm asking.
You're out of time.
I'm out of time.
Yeah. So like that's one problem. Also, another part of this is that this is set in the context of a secular democracy. So like they bring up all these examples of like India and like not India, but like they bring up all of these extreme examples of how this could possibly go wrong. But keep in mind that we're set in a like secular democracy where a lot of people probably don't want, or like there would be no possible situation where a religious group would allow murder of some sort, or like something along those lines. So we think you should buy this, and that this system, a separate legal system, exists within reasonable bounds. So like murder isn't allowed, even if it's allowed in a religious thing, which of course there are no like canon law and Sharia law don't allow that. I'll take you in a while. Okay, so like that's the analysis of the model, and I think like that fundamentally is where our cases diverge, because they come up and they give this. Charlotte comes up and she gives this analysis about how religious systems are so coercive, but all of the analysis is in the status quo. It's all about like how they have their own communities, and it's hard to leave these communities in the real world today. But that's like just a reason why the status quo is really, really shitty. We think it would be good to allow this like opt-in default system to provide legal protection to like children who are set in the system, so that yes, like when they turn 18, they can choose to like opt into canon law or Sharia law. And probably, like, their community view will be definitely informing that decision. But there's an aspect of this too, which is that like our community view as like regular people in a secular democracy definitely informs the view that we have. So like there's no higher ground that Charlotte stands on by saying like their community is necessarily bad. There's still a choice in there, so I think that solves a lot of the coercion that she's talking about, because there's a choice, and that choice doesn't exist in the status quo right now, because and in the system you're in by default in the regular system until you opt into like the non-system at a certain age. So like bottom line, status quo is bad. This solves some of that, and in either world there still will be some element of coercion by living in a certain community. So let's go on to, okay, so like Dan brought up this idea of a fractionalized religious community, but keep in mind that we're not letting religious communities come up with their own laws. These are only like religious laws that already exist. So like Sharia law and canon law, they're set down and written down. We're not like saying by popular vote, everyone who identifies with Christianity gets to create their own legal system. So why do we think this is good? Several reasons. The first of which is that fundamentally, like, there's this religious, we think that people shouldn't be bound by a system that they don't believe in. So if they like fundamentally don't believe that whatever is going on, then they have the choice to opt into a different system that within bounds is more reasonable for them. And we also think this like solves a lot of problems in the States and like the US, for example, because there are all of these like resources that there aren't enough resources in the legal system, so we can free that up if we allow like an alternative legal system which provides like more benefits for the marginalized in society. Sure, I'll take it, Charlotte.
Okay, so I'm really confused about what you're arguing, because on the one hand you're saying you're not defending the status quo and give this weird opt model, but then on the other hand you're saying that these religious groups don't get to create their own laws, they have to use the same laws that exist now. What are you defending?
Sorry if that was unclear. So the motion explicitly says Sharia law and canon law. So we're not saying cannabis church, go create whatever you want in terms of legal system. It is like predefined Sharia law that was like made hundreds of years ago in canon law, to clarify. So it's like we're saying we want that choice. We want people, if they want, to be able to choose these systems that already exist, not make up whatever the fuck they want today. And these are also substantial religious communities. So a lot of like the problems that you bring up aren't specific to the context of a secular democracy with substantial religious communities. There aren't substantial religious communities in any secular democracy that believe that murder is okay or like child marriage is okay. That doesn't exist in a secular democracy, and it's like of a substantial community. Thank you.
Same here.
I was actually, so we switched, so my speech is only partially written. It's going to be a little bit of ad-libbing.
That is what debate is.
I like that. Okay. One second, sorry.
Y'all gotta figure out your speaking order.
Huh? Yeah, I know. We should nail that down before, we go to the UK.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the first part of the debate, I was really under the impression that the op side understood the nuances of, like, creating different religious systems and allowing people to opt in, but then when we heard that Sharia law was set hundreds of years ago and that could just be applied because there are already so many Muslims that buy into it. They opened the door to saying that let's give an example. The only actual country right now where Sharia law has literally been taken from 100 years ago, put in place, is currently Saudi Arabia, who executes people for saying, oh, I'm an atheist. They are literally advocating for Saudi Arabia, which is literally the worst possible extreme example of advocacy that they might get on their side. There are other examples, other paths that they could have taken that would have made this a more interesting debate, but they left all of that nuance behind and closed the door on themselves. So, so on this opt-in system, it is very hard. It is very hard to opt into a system that exists, given that system is not representative. So this is going to be my extension in that the government is going to have to play favorites, because this is going to be set up by the democracy that's already in place, right? Because this currently doesn't. Because this currently wouldn't exist on their side, and if a government has to set up different ways of governing for each religious group, it's going to have to, for example, like Will said in response to my POI, defer to the Pope. There are a lot of Catholics that might not agree with the Pope. There are also a lot of different types of Christianity that wouldn't be represented. You seem to disagree.
Yeah, but I mean, is your argument like this would be logistically hard? Isn't that kind of like avoiding what we should be arguing about?
No, I'm saying that this would be literally impossible. Like, logistically hard would be like, okay, so there are a bajillion different religions in the world. The thing is, there aren't a billion different religions in the world. There are 7 billion, because each different person has their own exact interpretation of what their religion is. They have a different interpretation of Sharia law, right? Sharia, like, if you have 10 Muslims sit in a room, read the Quran together, they're going to have 10 different interpretations of every single verse, right? And also, these laws are never actually meant to be followed as a legal code. They're right now being argued over and set by academics, right? So do you really want to put a bunch of disagreeing academics in charge of a legal system that actually has to determine people's fates in the real world? That's not really the ideal system. So it's not a logistical challenge. The challenge is going to be, not right now, the challenge is going to be actually accommodating every person's individual religious views. And if you don't do that, then you're inherently disenfranchising people. Because when the government picks favorites, it can't adapt to everyone. Not right now. Then what you're saying is that you have to abide by a religious community that might be oppressive to you in some way, or that you might, and then if you abide by the secular system, you might have to essentially abandon other views that you hold. Also, this opens up the door to a whole nother slew of problems the top half didn't even get to, and that's the idea of actually telling people what they are, or having people say what they are. And that's another problem with this opt-in model that we get from OpSide, right? Because when the government asks you, like, okay, do you want to be tried by a Christian system, right? Do you want to be tried by a Muslim system? Do you want to be tried by one of like these pick a system out of these 5, right? Because obviously they couldn't really have like a bajillion things on a piece of paper. You need someone to narrow down or simplify a part of their identity that is inherently really complicated, right? And you need someone to make a choice of whether they turn their back on their religion, because that is how it would be perceived, right? No, I want to be tried outside of my faith. What is that saying to the people in their community? What is that saying to their family members? Or I want to be tried by my faith, but what if not everything that they do is within the confines of their faith? So you're now telling people that they have to put an identity in themselves, when the very idea behind the separation of church and state is that all sorts of different religions can exist, and it's not just inter-religious communication, right? It's intra-religious as well. It's to say that, like, if you disagree with the way that your family, or the religion that your family might subscribe to, it's saying that you have other avenues for advocacy. Now that advocacy is so much harder to find for people that might not feel comfortable in their own religious communities, because it's a more visible statement of, because judicial records tend to be public, of someone saying, oh no, I want to be tried by a secular system. What is that saying? What are you hiding? All of these questions come up, right? And we don't want to make people uncomfortable like that. We want people to feel like society is there to protect them, is there to provide a safety net, is there when their family units, when their outer communities don't function, because that's what society is for in the end. And we think that on your side of the house, you fail to do this, right? You had a question back half?
Oh, yeah. I was wondering how the model is literally any different in like the way that it's constantly changing than a secular system being determined by academics. How's that different?
a secular system being determined by academics is at least somehow written down on paper and is not currently being argued over. Right now, you have Sharia law that exists in academia that is constantly being developed. And yes, I know what you're saying.
Does the Supreme Court exist?
There are inherent differences in the way both systems are set up, and we think that you don't need to call it course.
Here, I should get a timer.
I'm really jealous of your pen.
I wish they were dead. I really don't know.
Okay.
Here, there's- yeah. I need to have it out, but yeah, sorry.
Okay.
You want me to put them in? Oh,
Is everyone
my phone.
more or less ready?
So
Yeah, I read
Okay.
I also really like your shirt.
Thank you. I really like it too. Okay. Let's first start on the model on the debate that the first half of government presented. We don't believe that it would be productive to apply laws from the past, like Sharia law from 100 years ago to now. That's why the secular legal system has changed too. We would argue that we take a more modern interpretation of what these laws are. We'd argue the difference between secular law and modern law is like our Constitution has changed. Some people still want to interpret it from the past. Similar things with religion. They're very similar in that way, but we would take the more modern lens and approach. Let's talk about the opt-in system, right? In the government's world, there is literally not an opt-in system. The default system is a secular system. This means that there is no autonomy in the choice about whether or not you make the decision of who you want to be judged by. This is why we believe this is really important, because all their arguments about coercion and all these issues about how these governments are not representative literally is their own side, right? At the point where a justice system literally does not care about people of color or queer people or anything like that, the secular system that they defend is as messed up as the system that they are trying to accuse us of. If there is any issue in this debate, this means that we acknowledge that there's issues on both sides, and that means that this is pretty much a wash. The thing that you need to evaluate in this round is what are the unique things outside of the possible harms of coercion that each side can possibly provide to this debate. And the reason is we're going to show you why the opposition has the best chance of providing these things. Let's first talk about this issue where they talked about like having to identify yourself. I would argue within these communities there are groups of people that like even if you like don't decide to be part of the like opt into a Christian church system, there's probably other Christians that didn't opt into the Christian church system as well, right? This means that even in that community, there's probably still a sub-community that would still support you in your Christianity, even if you were part of the Christian church. What they are doing is trying to paint the entirety of these religions as one giant group that as soon as you join or exit out of certain things will immediately excommunicate you from the system. I would argue that's not a very nuanced approach to how these religious groups work, and they're much more nebulous with subsections. So if you decide to opt into the community, well then you into like the religious legal system, that you might have people in your community that might be like, I'm not a fan of that, I won't hang out with you. But you might also have people that be like, that's okay, and you will find your new community and you will still find people. I would argue that the major independent reason about why religion is good is because what is the purpose of a legal system? The purpose of a legal system is justice and to reduce the amount of violent crime. And the reason why these secular systems work much better than, but the reason why religious systems work much better than secular systems are for two reasons. First, it's closer to people, and second, God. First, on the first issue, the idea of that this is something that you have created is much more uniquely part of your culture, right? It is part of your heritage as a Christian, as a Muslim, as a Hindu, as any other major religion in the world. The laws and things you are living by is something that you believe just outside of the legal system. Just because the legal system tells me that, like, if I speed at a certain park, if I speed too fast, I'll pay a fine, doesn't mean that, like, that doesn't really represent me. There's not something that I can connect to the legal system in that way, which is different for a religious legal system, where the ideas and principles not just are restricted to a specific law, specific words on a paper, but an entire culture, which means they're much more impactful. Because if God tells you that it's an eye for an eye, and if you kill another person, you should also be killed, that is not simply something words on paper, it's more of a culture that you live in. So it's much more impactful. People listen more to that, and it affects their lives in a much larger way. The second, even more important idea is this idea of God, right? In majority of these large Abrahamic religious communities, there's an idea that once you die, if you have sinned, have you done things wrong, then you suffer an eternity in some sort of damnation, whether that's heaven whether you do something good, you go to heaven, or that's bad, you go to hell. There's this idea that punishment does not end with life, right? A secular approach, whether someone gets a death penalty or spends the rest of their life in prison. Yes.
Everything you're saying is based on Abrahamic beliefs. Is based on Christian.
Sure. Do you want to talk about Hinduism? The idea that you don't reach, you continuously become reincarnated until the point where you reach moksha. Like the idea that you have to reach a certain point in a religion to ascend and join the larger being is a principle in the majority of large religions practiced by the majority of people. So I'd argue that the idea in a lot of these religions is that there is some punishment that exists outside of the life you live. In a secular legal system, punishment ends either when the person is executed or either when they have spent their entire time in jail. The idea and the threat of committing a crime in these systems is one of eternity. And I would argue that the idea that you will be punished for eternity for any crime you have committed during your life is a much better deterrent and a much better form of justice than anything secular justice can provide. And this is why I would argue, given everything else literally being awash in the debate, the idea of coercion, I say this word differently every time I've said it. Thank you. These ideas, it's literally awash in this debate. There's nothing uniquely bad about either one of these systems. So I would argue that literally the most important thing is the two biggest takeaways you're going to take away from this is one, people are able to relate closer to this law, thus they are more likely to follow it. And two, the idea of punishment is one that it just extends outside of the lifetime, and thus people fear it much more, and thus they don't commit crimes as often.
Here.
What's the hotel thing?
Well, first,
Do y'all want to get an Airbnb, which is what I would recommend. One of you has to front that.
I mean, I can front it. I just need to talk to the person who's in charge of reimbursement.
We can reimburse you the moment, essentially. Like,
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can just.
Well,
I can
within
do
2
it.
weeks.
So then I think we should have a separate
Not a
meeting.
moment.
I mean, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, I
I
think
thought
we
you
can
were-
talk about it. I'm willing to front the money. But it'll be on my credit card, so I just need it.
So wait, you have Airbnbs, right, Charlotte?
What?
Do you have Airbnbs?
I send all the information to Dan.
Wait, so
Yeah.
who's in charge of this now?
Not me.
For Oxford, it's
Yeah.
one of you. Like, it's one of the people
Okay,
going to Oxford.
like, can we just communicate it? Like,
I don't
I'll-
know what Airbnb stand is.
I can send Dave the Airbnb links.
okay, and then I just pay for the Airbnbs,
Yeah.
and then okay.
And then you get reimbursed.
But
Yeah.
for both Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah, how much is it for both of them?
I'm not sure.
I mean,
Well,
is it
for Cambridge? Like, we'll find
Is it-
another way.
so yeah, is it less than $2,000?
Yes.
Okay.
It better be less than $2,000. If it's more than $2,000, we're not staying in Airbnb.
Because I'm limited. Okay. Talak. If we were married in India, you would have just got divorced. And what is the implications as a spouse? Well, you lose all your possessions and suddenly you're just cast to the wayside. Okay, so before I begin and get into the meat of my speech, I just want to start with a few points of refutation. First, there's this idea of like relatability, and so Op is going to sit here and falsely tell you that because people can more strongly relate to their religions, that they're less likely to obey it, and thus you get a decrease in criminal activity, which is essentially just a false equivalency because they act like immorality and deviance just suddenly go away. So in the status quo, and even in the op world that they try to bring forth, we still have people who know what the right thing is to do. We know we shouldn't run red lights. We know we shouldn't run past stop signs, and we know that we shouldn't like kill other people. But guess what? It still happens on either side. And so there's also this idea that like because the legal implications in a religious sense extend far beyond life and into death, that somehow that's a more effective deterrent for crime. And that's just simply not the case because there are so many people who cannot even ascertain as to whether or not like there even is an afterlife to begin with. So those are like two exceedingly like weak points, but I just want to start off by just echoing some of the things that Dan told you. So he told you that like introducing this model would be inherently more complicated because of the fractionalization that would come out of it. So we think that what Op is trying to do is trying to essentially introduce a measure that is more divisive, that is more complex, and that albeit it's sort of a little bit of a caveat, but there's no logistical framework for how we're going to introduces. And Dan also tells you about like how picking a legal system that you want to opt in or out of has severe implications as far as legal loopholes are concerned. So we're not talking about census of communities here. We're talking about what legal system is going to try you. Okay, and so if someone commits a crime as a Christian, maybe they want to opt into the secular religion to get tried that way. Or like maybe they'll be seeking a harsher sentence. And so because there's no uniformity in how these juridical systems are established, that opens up a whole slew of loopholes that people could potentially exploit in order to get out of more severe punishments. We also tell you that like centralization of religion is bad, just for IDing people. Like having a system where people opt in make it exceedingly difficult and actually sort of is a very reductive approach to how people deal with their religiosity in the 21st century. So we tell you that on this side of the house, even in a secular state, we can still have religious individuals who live peacefully and like still have that same sense of community, i.e. in the case of the Amish, that op is telling you just somehow go away overnight. And we also tell you that like politics, like, so democracy is one of the staples of democracy is the separation of church and state. And why is that the case? It's because politics and religion, while they may be similar, are inherently distinct from one another. In that some pastors, especially in places like the Appalachian and Deep South, are against queer individuals. Some of them are homophobic, and some of them are open to having queer individuals in their house. We tell you that like the political spectrum, even inter-religiously, varies widely depending on who you speak to. And so we think that Opp's whole case is built on this sort of idea of appeasement and not necessarily efficiency. This is precisely why religious institutions have no place in our juridical process, is because inherently there's no uniformity in how people are going to be tried, and this is all about sort of trying to give some greater sense of community, some greater levels of appeasement to religious individuals who are presently living within the state. But we tell you that one of the active benefits to the model that we're proposing is objectivity. And so they're going to tell you that, like, oh, on our side of the house, like, it'll be better because, like, people will be more deterred from committing crimes. And we tell you that on this side of the house, because we're a secular state, we can have an Islamic judge try an Islamic defendant or plaintiff, if you'd like. And so we tell you that like we get more objectivity because we're not bogged down by the politics of our religion. And this is better for the members of the community. But also Dan tells you that like if you actually buy Opp's case, it's going to be terrible for the citizenry because this policy prioritizes the larger religions, inherently marginalizing the smaller, otherwise fringe ones. And so we're going to have to defer to people like the Pope, the Pope, although we'd like to believe him to be this sort of like moral righteousness that's representative of everyone, has his own moral framework and has his own political set of political values. And so we believe that this is not a very good way to introduce religion back into our society. And then lastly, we just tell you that like this totally complicates the process because this is not just a case whereby politics affects religion, but actually it's not unidirectional, but actually bidirectional. So there's so many implications for introducing these religious appendages into our juridical and legal process, just insofar as how we conduct ourselves domestically, but also in terms of our foreign policy. For all these reasons, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Six minutes?
5 minutes.
5. Everybody not ready? Okay, let's go. So, what makes a good law for people? 2 points I want to readdress. First,
people have to believe it. Second, people have to feel it. This is as brought up by my partner just now, and I want to reinforce that point and address that these 2 points are the fundamentals aspects of a law. And although religious law kind of has the conflict with the ideology with secular law, but religious law essentially performs better in the sense of they are more close to people, and people feel the power of it. It's especially religious people believe in the afterlife, and they feel that the judgment of the religious law have even powerful implement on them, whether or not they are alive or they are dead. And this thing, secular law, it cannot achieve it. So also religious law, it's closer to people, that people are more willing to obey it, and they find it easier to obey it. But if it turns to a very complicated structure of the secular law, people may not even tell what their consequences will be after they commit whatever a crime later. Okay, this is the first part. I want to rebuild what we should really think about whether it's a good law or not. Second, one of the biggest theme we mentioned in this round is about coercion. Whether or not religious law is the choice of people, whether people are coerced. So the first thing I want to mention is that secular law can also be coerced. Most of the arguments made before are generally based on the democratic structure that is essential in developing countries. But all of us have forgotten that in many countries in the world, we have a lot of undemocratic societies. And how should we make people a better living in those kind of societies? That's what we should think about. And in most of the third world country, they have even more coercion from the political power, from the secular law. So in this way, we cannot tell that religious law should be bad. And second, about the exclusiveness of coercive law, as mentioned by the Deputy Prime Minister, like people don't have the access to the perspective outside. That is not caused by the religious law. That is actually caused by the immobility of the different communities. What we should really think about is how to connect those communities rather than abandon the existence of a law.
Honest.
Yeah.
Religions, and especially religious laws, are interpreted and dictated by those in power, which are usually men, especially in Sharia and canon law, rather than topics that are up for discussion as in a democracy. Don't people get comparatively more ability to express themselves and opt in or out in a democracy rather than in a religious law?
What I want to say about this is a lot of argument made to abandon religious law is based on democracy. This is a underlying assumption of the model as we see, but it is not stated by anyone. I'm just here to point it out. We should be aware of this underlying assumption. So to finish, I want to say despite of the outdated and oppressive aspect of religious law, people still need it because it is the law that people feel more closer to. It is the law that people feel its power and have the will to believe in it, and it makes a community better off and leads to less crime. Thank you.
Good job. Yeah, you too, man.